Welcome everyone. Welcome to the CIWEM South West branch talk about Bristol City's flood risk management strategy. Before our presenters start, I'd just like to say a few words as a little introduction before we crack on. This is one of several talks scheduled by CIWEM on the flood and resilience theme. There's details of a few other up-and-coming talks on both flood resilience and various other topics. You can find them on our website. There's a talk on river restoration tomorrow, natural capital, a flood protection scheme in Northern Ireland, as well as talks about water industry items such as groundwater supply, the impacts of COVID-19 and achieving net zero. As I say, those details on the website if you're interested. We've also got the Young Environmentalists of the Year, and that's for those in the first 5 years of their career who are sort of contributing by raising environmental awareness and understanding. There's further details and special bit of the website on that. The deadline is coming up on the 18th of December, so if you are interested in entering yourself, or you know someone who could be notioned to entering, there are prizes. It's worth doing. Quick bit of housekeeping. This is being recorded, so just to let everyone know that, and it will be made available afterwards on CIWEM's YouTube channel. If you save all your questions to the end, we've got a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the session, so we'll cover everything at once then after the speakers. Equally, if you could ensure microphones are muted during the presentation, that would be appreciated. We plan for the talks to last around an hour, and then we'll move into the question and answer, and try and cover questions in the time left over before closing at 7:30. So finally, without much further ado, I'd like to say thank you very much to Matt, Dan and Henrietta, our presenters tonight from Bristol City Council and Derek, for agreeing to give this presentation and the effort put into preparing these presentations. Looks a fantastically interesting talk. We're looking forward to this. Briefly, the format tonight will be 3 talks covering the ambition and the strategy, the challenges of flood modelling, and then the strategic outline case. So I'll hand over to Matt, who's going to talk through the first segment. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Evening all. My name's Matt Sugden. I'm a flood risk engineer at Bristol City Council. I've been working on this for a number of years now, and the flood strategy is now out to consultation. So really big milestone for the project, and great to be here talking about it now. So 3 speakers, as Richard was just saying. I'm going to give a bit of an overview from Bristol City Council's perspective, and then Dan's going to give a bit more detail around the modelling that was done. And Hen will talk about some of the challenges and the preparation of the strategic outline case. So let's start at the beginning. Why do we need a flood strategy in the first place? Well, Bristol, the flood mechanisms in Bristol are fairly complex. It lies right at the bottom of a very large river catchment. The River Avon catchment kind of goes all the way up to the north to the Cotswolds and down in the south from the Mendips, and brings with it all of that flow from rainwater falling on South Gloss, Baines, even parts of Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. And it arrives slap bang in the middle of Bristol city centre and is met with the tide coming up the River Severn. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the River Severn Estuary has the second largest tidal range in the world, and that comes up the River Severn and into the central Bristol via the River Avon and meets in the middle with the flows coming down from upstream. So add to the mix as well, we've got a floating harbour in the middle of Bristol, early 19th century water body that was constructed to facilitate a constant water body to mitigate the effects of the rising tide on the boats that were moored in central Bristol, and that just adds an extra layer of complexity. So it's complex, but you know, flooding is not something that could happen. It does happen in Bristol. Most years, when we get particularly high spring tides, we expect to get minor tidal flooding in and around low spots of the Avon. In the last decade, we've had over 20 tidal floods that we have recorded, and perhaps somewhat concerningly, the highest was this year, in fact. So yeah, flood mechanisms are complex, and you know, we haven't had a severe flood, but we could. But as well as that, we've got you know, quite historic and piecemeal infrastructure. You can see you know, there are low spots along the banks of the River Avon in the image on the right. We get regular overtopping in various locations, but as well, you know, our flood risk infrastructure that we do have is aging. So the floodgates on the left there are our principal flood defence gates that protect our floating harbour from the tide that comes up the River Avon. But you can see quite clearly that, you know, they're outflanked, and the kind of silvery objects that you can see on either side of the gate. So they're the control mechanisms. So obviously the mechanisms themselves are quite vulnerable to rising sea levels. So a few facts and figures. Well, in the current climate and with the flood defence infrastructure that we operate and maintain in the current day, around about 1,100 properties are at risk of flooding should we have a severe tidal event or severe fluvial event in the city centre, and a further 200 properties in communities kind of upstream and downstream. And of course, sea level rise, climate change is doing nothing to kind of make that any better. And if we were not to take any action other than maintain what we've got already, then by the end of the century, we can expect to see about 4,500 existing properties at risk by the end of the century. And that last bullet point on the screen there is really quite striking to me. So a tidal flood event that has or a flood event, I should say, that has a 0.5% probability of happening in any given year in the current climate could become as frequent as a 63% annual probability by the end of the century. So the kind of event that you see on the bottom left image there, where large areas of central Bristol would be flooded, that could be as common as a 63% annual probability event by the end of the century. So obviously a lot of strong evidence there to point us down the need for a flood strategy. So a bit of background as to how we kind of got to where we are now. This kind of spans my entire career at the council. In fact, when I joined in 2009, we quickly went into a piece of work in 2010, scoping out a piece of work called the Central Area Flood Risk Assessment. And that was really the first time this sort of joint probability of fluvial flows coming down the system coinciding with tidal surges up the system and what impact that would have in central Bristol was assessed. And various consultants have been involved with this over the years. We're here today talking with Arup, but Hyder, Mott, Siegenveld, Young, AECOM are just a few of the consultants that have worked with us to get us to this point in time. Some of you might be wondering, well, hang on, River Avon, main river, why the Environment Agency not leading on this? And the Environment Agency are a really key partner, and they are a joint promoter of the scheme. You'll notice that the branding is on the consultation, and everything's been done in coordination with the agency as a scheme promoter, and they sit on our board. But for various reasons, it makes a lot of sense for Bristol to be leading, not least because of the impact on opportunity for the city in terms of development opportunities. One of the strategy objectives when they were first set all the way back in 2015-16 was around supporting sustainable development in the city, and that's become even more important in the present day. Here we are in 2020. So having done all of this work dating back from 2010, examining the risk, and then getting to a point in time around 2015 where we committed to developing a strategy, that's when the kind of option appraisals work started with our partners AECOM back in 2015-16. And that went through the usual options appraisal processes, kind of assessing various measures against economic and environmental assessment processes to arrive at a preferred strategic approach. And the approach you can kind of see on the screen there is it's about raised defences along the north bank predominantly of the River Avon, through mostly centred on the middle of Bristol. But because of the impact on water levels upstream and downstream that those defences would have, measures are proposed as far upstream as Keynsham, which is a town near Bath, between Bristol and Bath, and all the way downstream near to the confluence with the River Severn in North Somerset at Peel, and on our side of the river in Shirehampton. And you can sum up, I suppose, our approach in 2 words there: adaptive and integrated. So integrated about, we need to integrate these defences into the fabric of the city, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. And adaptive, so making sure what we do in the short term doesn't preclude us from taking a different course in the longer term, and also, make sure that we are able to adapt and respond to climate change as our understanding around it evolves, and indeed as it actually plays out in practice. So then, having arrived at this preferred strategic approach of raised defences, it was kind of like, well, so what's our vision for what that looks like for Bristol? What does it mean for Bristol? And the vision there is really all about making sure that we design measures that work for Bristol year round. So we are at a strategic outline case stage at the moment. No designs have been developed. All of this kind of illustrations and things like that you'll see in the consultation and the strategic case itself are kind of concepts, not designs. But it's really important for Bristol that we make sure that we measure, design measures that don't just provide a flood defence function on the very rare occasions that we require those defences to stand up, but actually we need measures that work for the city year round. So that little diagram on the bottom left there kind of tries to sum that up a little bit. So it's not just flood resilience, it's flood resilience at the centre of, incorporating opportunities for new green spaces and improved landscape. It's about improving biodiversity and opportunities for flora and fauna along the River Avon corridor. Movement is a really big one for us. Those that know Bristol will know it's a very hilly city. So having this east-west link through the city to provide a flat walking or cycling rink to get to various places is, a great thing for us. And then it's also about making sure that we take the opportunity to enhance and protect our existing heritage and culture. Bristol's got a rich engineering history, and it's also got very sensitive areas. Underfall Yard being the area where the predominant control mechanisms for our floating harbour are located is a scheduled ancient monument, so there kind of is no higher designation. So when we're working and designing new infrastructure around these places, obviously they need to be very sensitive to the heritage and culture that we have in the city. Those three bullets there kind of just sum it up as best we can. It's kind of like three pillars, is our cabinet member that with responsibility for this talks about them. It's about future-proofing our city and the neighbouring communities. So that's making sure our communities are resilient to flooding over the next century. It's about enabling a greener and more active city. So like I was just saying, making sure that as we deliver this new infrastructure, we take opportunities to do it in such a way that we incorporate new green spaces and improve biodiversity and incorporate more active travel links. And lastly, a really important one for us is making sure that we take the opportunity to unlock Bristol's potential. So this is about growth and regeneration predominantly. Two huge areas of Bristol identified in the kind of emerging local plan for significant growth and regeneration also happen to be those two areas that are at most significant risk of flooding from the River Avon. So by doing these defences, not only do we kind of support development and enable it to come forward, the development brings with it investment that in turn helps us to deliver the defences to protect our existing homes and businesses. So these then are just a few little illustrations that we came up with to kind of bring it to life a little bit for the consultation and explain to people in a visual way of how we can do things in such a way that don't just provide a flood defence function. So obviously it's not an exhaustive list, but submergible paths and parks, this is what I was talking about, incorporating cycle links, but doing it in such a way that they are resilient to flooding, and once the flood water recedes, you can just go back to enjoying the river, getting close to it and spending time near it. Terracing, an example I've got on the next slide from another area of the country, whereby some of these defences ultimately over time will have to be quite high in comparison to existing ground levels if climate change plays out in the way that we're forecasting it to at the moment. So we need to be sensitive to the existing landscape, not just views, but also the character of the area. So where space is available or space can be made available, we can look at opportunities to incorporate terracing to create great destinations to visit in Bristol that also provide that flood defence function. And then other examples on the bottom there, like I said, lots of regeneration going on in Bristol at the moment, and space can be constrained in a already very urban environment like we have in the city centre. But there's opportunities to incorporate flood defences into the fabric of the building. There's other areas of the city where much more space may become available, and in those types of situations, we're looking to kind of promote this idea of making a linear sort of green space where we can incorporate biodiversity improvements and create great places again for people to be. And on the very rare occasion where we do need to protect the development or existing homes behind, it plays that function too. So those illustrations brought to life again, the top left there, a lot of you might recognise that's Bath, the same river, different problem. So largely they have a conveyance problem, whereas our problem in central Bristol is more driven by the tide. But again, it's just showing an example of how flood defence infrastructure doesn't need to just provide that one function. It can incorporate landscape and biodiversity improvements. It can incorporate landscape walking links and parks, and just give people the opportunity 99 days out of 100 to be able to get down to the river and enjoy it, but still have that infrastructure in place that protects behind when you do need it. And again, other side of the river on the bottom left in Bath, again, example of how flood defence has been integrated into the fabric of a refurbished building. Terracing example is the South Bank in London. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that we're going to create a new South Bank for Bristol, but it's just an example of where this technique of terracing has been used to create a great kind of destination. And then other examples there, how in across the Atlantic in the States, Delaware, I think that example's from, where they've just incorporated a kind of a linear grease space along the corridor. And one other potential solution that I personally don't favour, but it is a feasible option for managing flood risk, is incorporating a kind of low-level defence in the short term, and then doing it in such a way that you can adapt over time and incorporate glass panels or glazing if you need to in a future point in time. So I'm sure lots of people will be interested, and certainly in all of the kind of engagement and stakeholder sessions that we've done so far, lots of people have been interested in the other options that we're not proposing as part of our strategic approach. I won't go through an exhaustive list, but basically, a lot of you will be familiar with the flood and coastal erosion risk management appraisal process. But essentially what we did was identify flood defence techniques that would be feasible in terms of practically effective in terms of reducing flood risk to Bristol, identified them, and then combined all of those in logical sequences to create a long list of strategic approaches. That long list was 39 kind of combinations of measures. That was then tested to reduce to a short list of 7, which was, obviously then assessed against various economic assessment appraisal processes, as well as assessing against our strategic objectives to arrive at the strategic approach that I've just outlined. But 2 things I'll just mention: tidal barrier and kind of slowing the flow upstream. So real big interest at the moment around natural flood management, I've found, just by talking to people in the city, and from reading the national media. It seems to be getting a lot more coverage at the moment. But of course, in terms of the tidal problem to central Bristol, land management practices and storing floodwater upstream is not going to do anything to manage that tidal flood risk. But we are getting a message loud and clear that in terms of managing that fluvial risk, we don't want to discount that, and we, as a council, we're very much supportive of utilising those types of approaches. We have done that within the city, and we are planning further schemes within the city as we speak. But going forward, it needs to perhaps come in a bit better into our overarching strategic approach. And then the tidal barriers. So Dan will talk a lot more about the modelling that we've been doing, but I think fair to say back in 2015, a lot of people that I was working with at the time, if they had to place a bet on where we might arrive in terms of the preferred approach to managing the risk from the River Avon, people would probably put their money on a tidal barrier at least being part of the solution. But having tested this rigorously with various hydraulic models and economic assessments and all the rest of it, it just doesn't quite work for Bristol. If you can imagine the Thames tidal barrier and picture that in your mind's eye, and picture the width of the channel of the Thames in the location at which it's sited, and then compare that to the width of the channel we've got to play with in Bristol, we have a far more constrained channel, and yet the flows coming down the river from the upstream catchment are actually quite comparable in various probability return periods. So what happens is you can raise the tidal barrier to keep the tide out, and that's fine. But what happens for the period of the barrier being raised is you get so much water coming down the system that it actually fills the channel up and overtops, and you end up in a situation where you have to have raised defences along the banks of the river in combination with the barrier anyway. So it just doesn't quite work for Bristol. Next steps then, and this is the last slide, it's just to say really that these proposals are at a very early stage. We've developed this strategy in the form of a strategic outline case. We've submitted that strategic outline case now to the Environment Agency in their role as regulator of Environment DEFRA Flood Defence Grant and Aid Pot. And we're going through that technical assurance process in parallel to the consultation that is live right now. But that, we hope, will get us to a point in time where the council's administration can make a decision on adopting this preferred approach that we have, and then quickly move into outline business case phase early next year in 2021, come summertime, and that will work through probably in a couple of business cases going together in parallel, and to be informed by further public engagement. Obviously we'll have to then get into detailed design work, gather our various consents, and hopefully get us to a point in time where the first phase of construction might begin on the ground around about 2025. All being well, this could be delivered by the end of this decade, but of course it doesn't stop there. It'll be regular reviews, examining what we've done, applying our emerging knowledge around climate change and all the rest of it to inform certain trigger points as we move forward into the latter part of the century. So thanks ever so much for listening. Like I said, the consultation is out now. I really do encourage you to put in your response either as an individual or as representing an organisation. This is the first chance, I suppose, we've really had to put this out to technical specialists. We're getting a lot of interest from stakeholder groups and residents and businesses, but we'd really value your kind of technical expertise in terms of criticising the work that's gone into this to get to a point where we've been able to put this out to consultation. So thanks ever so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing now so Dan can then take over and control the slides, and over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Matt. Hopefully everyone can see that. I'm Daniel Vandelier from Arup. I will be talking to you today about the hydraulic model used for the strategy. I'll be talking about what we're trying to model, why we need a model, and what the model can show us. So as Matthew has already mentioned, Bristol sits towards the downstream end of a substantial catchment. The focus of this strategy is the River Avon. The catchment area is over 2,000 square kilometres, and by the time the river gets to Bristol, flows within the river are substantial during flood events, and these can combine with high tides to cause flood risk within Bristol. The other source of flooding is very high tide levels, such as that occurred in March this year due to tidal surge events. And these can propagate up the river into Bristol. And even without high flows coming down the river, the tidal flood risk is enough to cause substantial risk within Bristol. So looking a little bit closer, not only do we have the River Avon flowing through Bristol, but we have a number of tributaries that converge and flow into the River Avon system. So it's important that the strategy considers the flows coming from these watercourses as they influence water levels along the Avon and also can impact on the options that are selected. So if we zoom in a little bit more, you'll see that not only do we have the River Avon, but we also have the floating harbour. The floating harbour is effectively a water control system. This was the original course of the Avon, and about 200 years ago, the floating harbour was constructed to provide safe mooring for trade vessels. Today, it's mainly used for recreation and navigation. So the floating harbour is effectively sealed off from the tide, and the Avon was diverted along what is known as the New Cut to the south of the harbour, and that remains tidal. So during normal flow conditions, the water level in the floating harbour is maintained at a fairly constant level, and this can be regulated using the underfall yard sluices. They can discharge excess flows from the harbour when necessary during low tide. So the system operates by Netham Weir maintaining a sufficiently high water level to enable navigation from the upstream reaches of the river into the floating harbour via the feeder canal. During flood conditions, the lock gates at either end of the system can be closed to effectively try to seal off the floating harbour system from the impacts of flooding. However, as we've seen earlier this year in March, the lock gates and the area around them isn't high enough to prevent those very high tide levels from getting into the floating harbour and causing flood risk. So why do we need a model? Well, we can look back at past flood events and learn from them, but they can't give us all the answers. They can't tell us what might happen in the future. Models are needed to understand flooding mechanisms, flood depths, and also to be able to provide the evidence to justify any actions that we take to manage the flood risk, such as which options we select, how big do they need to be built, and where. So as I mentioned, we had a pretty big tidal event back in March, which even by today's climate isn't considered an extreme event. So flood risk could potentially be greater. We also need to consider how the climate might change into the future. So a big driver for that in Bristol is sea level rise. And the graph on the right just illustrates the amount of uncertainty in these climate change projections. So this is from the latest research, and this is for a range of different climate scenarios. So anything we do needs to try and consider this uncertainty. So we've established the need for a model. So a model can be thought of as a virtual representation of a system. In this case, it's the river system. So for the strategy, the model has been constructed all the way from the Severn Estuary, from Avonmouth, all the way into Bristol. So that's the naval representation of the influence of the tide all the way into Bristol. And it also extends upstream past Keynsham. And this is to be able to represent those areas at flood risk from very high river flows. The river channels within the model are represented using cross sections, and the data for these cross sections comes from topographic survey. For the areas upstream and downstream of Bristol, those cross sections have been extended across the floodplain to represent the floodplain. However, within Bristol itself, a more accurate approach has been taken, which is to use a 2D floodplain model, which I will talk about in a minute. So the 2D floodplain model is dynamically linked to the river system so that the interaction is represented. So the river model not only includes the open channels, but also all the culverts associated with the river system. For example, the stormwater interceptor sewer, which runs to the north of Bristol city centre, is included, and that can take excess flows from the River Frome system and discharge them into the Avon downstream of Bristol. This zoomed in section on the right here just gives you an idea of the level of detail within the model. It includes other riverine structures such as bridges and culverts, sluice gates and weirs. So the 2D model represents those areas at flood risk within Bristol, and it uses high resolution digital terrain model data, LiDAR data, on a fixed 5-meter grid. So effectively it has elevation points every 2.5 meters in each direction. And this enables it to work out where the flooding would go once it comes out the river. It's able to kind of represent flow routes along roads, around buildings, etc. In addition to the LiDAR data, the model also includes bathymetric data for the floating harbour and additional layers to improve the accuracy of the model, including the riverbanks, which are all based on topographic survey data. So that's the geometry of the model. What we also need is to know how much water is coming into the model. The river system hydrological analysis has been undertaken based on gauge data, and this considers the whole catchment that drains into the Avon. For the Bristol strategy model, there's 30 individual inflows representing that within the model. Not only are the inflows peak inflows are calculated, but we also use real-world gauge data of past flood events to come up with a representative hydrograph shape for the biggest inflows coming into the model. In addition to the water coming into Bristol from the rivers, we also have the water coming up the river from the tide. So that is defined using water level versus time information based on national coastal information. And because Bristol is kind of uniquely placed, we also have to consider how the river flows can combine with the tide levels. So for this, joint probability analysis has been undertaken to work out what potential combinations of high flow river flows and high tide levels could combine for each probability flood. Those have then been tested through the model to identify worst case scenarios. So a model is all very well and good, but we need to have some confidence in it before we can use it in earnest to make decisions. For the Bristol Avon strategy, the model has undergone a calibration and validation exercise, and this is where we put real-world flood events through the model based on things like rain gauge data and things like that, and then we compare the model's predictions against the observations, including gauged water levels from river gauges, as well as flood outlines. And this has been done for a range of tidal floods and fluvial floods. And the results have demonstrated that by calibrating the model and validating it, we have an acceptable level of accuracy that can be used in the strategy. So once we have a calibrated model, we can start using it. So the kinds of information that we can get out of the model are water levels and flows, and we can see how those kind of things change over time as the flood wave passes through the river system, through Bristol. So in this example on this slide, we're plotting how water level changes over time during the flood at 3 different locations. So upstream of Netham Weir, further downstream, and then further downstream still. And you can see how the influence of the tide reduces as you go in an upstream direction, as you'd expect. But the interesting thing here is that even for fluvially dominated events, it's the high tide, which is combining with that high river flow, which actually causes the overtopping of the riverbanks. So as well as looking at how water levels vary over time, we can also look to see how they vary along the river. So on each of these 3 plots, we have Avonmouth off to the left and Netham, the upstream area in Bristol, on the right-hand side. So this demonstrates water levels and how they vary along the river for different probability floods. So the most extreme here being the red line, which is the 0.1% annual chance flood, down to the more frequent 5% flood in yellow. So this is given for both fluvial on the top and tidal on the bottom, and we can kind of combine this information to learn which type of flood gives us our worst case water levels at any point along the river. So the graph on the right that is demonstrating there's a kind of switch point between tidal and fluvial around Netham Weir or just before it. So as well as looking at results in the river, we can also look to see what's happening on the floodplain when the river overtops. So this is an example output showing flood depths. So it's color coded, so red is deep and blue is shallow. And this is also showing streamlines. So these show the dominant flow paths, and we can use this information to learn about how the water spreads, how it moves around a floodplain, and the flooding mechanisms. This is a similar plot spot at the Cumberland Basin and Junction Lock. This is for a tidal flood, and this is showing how water is overtopping and outflanking the lock gates, causing flows to enter the floating harbour. And lastly, I'm just going to end on a slide just showing one of the applications of modelling within the strategy. So as Matthew has already mentioned, the preferred option is for raised flood defences along the River Avon. There's obviously been a lot of modelling work to get to that point. However, there's still a little bit of modelling work we had to do. So in the example figure on the left, this is showing that there were some areas where the proposed flood defences were having an adverse impact to some areas within Netham. And this is because there are some overland flows coming from Brislington Brook, which enters from the south, and putting in defences basically prevented them from discharging into the River Avon as freely as they otherwise would. So we used the model to test a number of different options here, and eventually come up with an option which had a slight realignment of a defence and an additional defence to hold a bit more water back on Brislington Brook. And as you can see in the figure on the right, this ensured no adverse impacts here to people or properties. And we actually substantially reduced the flood risk from Brislington Brook here. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll now pass over to my colleague, Henrietta.
Right, so I'll just share my screen. 1 second. I suggest if you're all stiff and need a bit of a stretch, it's a good moment while I do the swap over. Okay, hopefully sharing the screen, and now we're into the slideshow. So I'm hoping everyone can see the screens. Thanks, Dan. I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the work that went into the Bristol Avon flood strategy. We Arup were brought on board to update the document and bring together all that wealth of knowledge developed by many partner organisations along the way, to update the modelling as Dan's taken you through, and to enable the integration of the flood defences with the strategic objectives. And I'm going to go into that a bit more, and evaluate the costs and benefits of different flood protection levels and standard of protections. And we also included an EIA pre-scoping report. A key lesson learned along the way for producing this document is that the Environment Agency's approach needs adapting to allow for the complexities and the nuances of a complex city like Bristol and the surrounding region. And it's been a real aspiration of our collective team, consisting of Bristol City Council, the EA and ourselves, to try and work through the grey areas and enable them to be both understood and allowed for within the strategy. And the involvement of BCC and their stakeholders has been a really key part of that process. And the strategy document is intended to set out a vision and a narrative for the flood defences to help set policy, engage with community in a collaborative way, which in turn allows decisions to be made which will unlock the funding and allow control over the process of reducing floods. So let's just revisit the strategic objectives that Matt raised. So they currently are to support safe living, working and travelling, to facilitate sustainable growth, to maintain natural, historic, visual and built environments, to ensure that navigation of the river and marine activities can continue, to enhance walking and cycling links, to bring existing communities closer together wherever possible, and to deliver enhanced recreational heritage and wildlife spaces. But lastly and not leastly, it's to ensure that the strategy is technically feasible and deliverable. So going into planning and development, aka to facilitate sustainable growth, in the case of Bristol, the requirement for flood defence could actually really unlock significant parts of Bristol for development. And the current national planning policy requires that developments in areas of risk of flooding should be avoided by directing the development away from areas of highest risk. And this is backed up by the local plan, which minimises the risk and impact of flooding in the context of new development. But the net result of that is it leads to flood risk in central Bristol, really creating a barrier to sustainable development. And as part of the emerging local plan review, in areas away from the flood risk, it's expected, new homes will be delivered in central Bristol and that the Bristol Temple Quarter will attract many jobs. But there is scope for significantly greater number of homes and further job generation development where the delivery of the flood risk management can unlock more potential. And this is focused in the proposed areas of growth and regeneration, such as Western Harbour, Bristol Temple Quarter and St Philip's Marsh, basically the 3 blobs of orange you can see on the map. So once the strategy is adopted by Bristol City Council and endorsed by the Environment Agency as having a reasonable prospect and certainty of delivery, the proposed developments in areas currently at risk of flooding can then rely on that planned strategy measures now and in future phases. And then the developments would have to manage the risk of an extreme flood or defence failures in the interim. But the strategy can be embedded into relevant planning policies and guidance, including any residual risk mitigation measures to be addressed as part of the planning application. So integrating these defences into development can be encouraged through the publication of local planning guidance, setting out expectations of how those developments could integrate them. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but just basically to say that integration means it's not just a wall, it can take many different forms. Matt went into some really good practical examples, but our preference will always be to develop designs and combine them with landscape features so that they deliver multiple benefits and are sympathetic. And decisions will have to weigh which aspects and components of the design are most important to each of the area of the city. So to go into a bit of detail, this is a map of the central area of Bristol. And if I start off with the Western Harbour, just to go a bit more into the character areas. So the Western Harbour is characterised by the presence of the large industrial infrastructure and buildings. It's where that new cut and the floating come together. Historically, it's incredibly important conservation area and links to favourite engineers of mine, William Jessup, is in Kingdom Brunel. And it's a real iconic gateway to Bristol with privileged views of the Clifton Suspension Bridge. And then moving east, you've got the Western Corridor, which goes all the way from Cumberland Road up to Temple Mead Station. It's very linear in nature. It's urban development, which is very close to the River Avon. There's a few brownfield sites left being developed, 2 major road crossings from the city centre to Bedminster and Totterdown. It's got some really good iconic wrought iron pedestrian bridges, and the north-south links are as important as the east-west links. As well as that, you've got a series of tourist destinations found along the corridor, such as SS Great Britain, the historic working docks, the M Shed, the Industrial Museum. and even the more recent Wapping Wharf development is an attraction and a destination in its own right. And they're all in easy reach and walking distance of Temple Meads railway station. There's also a historic 1.8 metre long low-level path called the Chocolate Path that runs part of the Western Harbour before going under Commercial Road towards Bathurst Basin. That's been traditionally used for cycling and walking between Temple Meads and Western Harbour. And it's adjacent to the route of Brunel's historic railway line that fed goods from the Americas right into the heart of Britain via Temple Meads. So moving east, we've now got the Eastern Corridor. Now that extends from Temple Meads on the west all the way through to Neffham Weir, and it's characterised by strong presence of industrial uses with quite low quality buildings and warehouses, and most of the areas really turn their back to the river, particularly along the northern bank. And as a result, this area is not inviting or attractive for recreation or living or even, working in some cases. And with the exception, there is a beautiful Spark Evans Park, which is an absolute haven for flora and fauna. But in contrast to the Western Corridor New Cut, here the River Avon is actually the original river, and it retains a beautiful natural winding character, and it's really quite lovely. But the river path is very narrow, particularly when you try and share it with cyclists. And I should also mention there are quite a few bridges that cross this area, again establishing very important north-south links for pedestrians and vehicles, as well as a railway link east towards Bath. So then right at the east end of the city flood defences, we've got Neffham Lock. And that's a lock at the junction of Feedham and Neffham that Dan was talking about. And it's where the River Avon diverges into the feeder canal. It's got quite a strong level of industrial character at the moment. But there's some naturalised presence. It's sort of naturalised by the vegetation slopes of Neffham Park to the north of Feeder Canal. And currently it's not a destination per se, but we could make it so. And actually those are pretty historic locks and housing for the pumping systems, which are Grade 2 listed and part of the Avon Valley Conservation Area. So just to summarise it also a little bit at the bottom, the diagram below reveals the network of green and blue infrastructure assets that are present in the city. And they include local green spaces and water courses. And the River Avon corridor is very instrumental in establishing these connections, both east-west and north-south, and we need to be cognizant of that. And actually, if we thought about it in a fully integrated way, thinking of it as a network of green corridors that could generate health, well-being, movement, and biodiversity, it could really not just improve the resilience of the city, but really help the city to become a better place to live. And the way you go about planning this is very important. So it could be possible to establish a sequence or a phasing of events to try and incorporate some of the flood defences in what's going to go on in the future. So I'll just go into a bit these are not set in stone. These are just some ideas of some of the ways you could incorporate different ways of doing flood defences. And here's one example. So here the images show a connected and open place in line with what happens in the M shed on the other side, but with two corridors defined by different surfacing materials and occasional seating. And the presence of the railway creates such a unique opportunity to explore the history of the harbour and be a tourist attraction. But because of the linear nature of the works and trying to keep open the railway, habitat creation and the introduction of vegetation is limited. So we've looked at, you could consider doing raised beds within the flood defence walls, and that would help to reduce the scale of the wall. But this area naturally lends itself to the creation of a significant green corridor, and the placemaking and the destination could be greatly improved by the introduction, for example, of continuous tree-lined footpath along the southern edge of the Cumberland. And all of this would allow people to get close to the river edge, even during flood events, and it would scale down the presence of roads and introduce a continuous line of greenery, really, to create a significant habitat and recreational corridor. And it's quite a limited opportunity for us to try and introduce something like this right into the city centre. So now I'm back at the Eastern Corridor. Now, most of the path of the Eastern Corridor is quite narrow, and it has very limited space to expand inland. The image on the left shows a location which might present some opportunities for tree planting. That's in the foreground, where the boundary wall kind of zigzags in and out. But actually, that's not the norm down there. And having the path immediately adjacent to the boundary wall, as you can sort of see in the distance, is actually more common. And to even retain 2.5 meters as best practice guidance is very difficult down there without encroaching into the river space or into the adjacent industrial plots. And placemaking opportunities are here, you know, they're kept quite simple. They're done on improving the aesthetics of the wall, creating good paving surfaces, pockets of planting, occasional seating areas, maybe some natural stone clad walls, maybe some fences to try and soften the narrow corridor. But then we could take it a step further, and the image on the right shows how a plot in the distance, which retains its current use where it's quite narrow, adjacent to a newly developed plot, could be integrated with the flood defences through just building up the earth and the ground. And the amenity value of that area becomes much improved, both for general public and the residents. I personally often imagine, because I have been down there quite a lot to have a look, imagine a cafe, a bookshop sort of sitting out there, and you can actually look at the river rather than be cut off from it. And this vision could be delivered through a phased approach where some plots are developed earlier than others, and we've got to think about how we can incorporate that. The ecological enhancements of the river corridor could also be explored through new habitat creation and conservation of existing. There's a lot of ecology and wildlife down there. And you could do things like introduce art elements and, you know, increasing on that sort of River Avon art sculptures that's working its way along that stretch of land. There are so many things and ways that we could embrace these flood defences. You know, we could look at trying to raise awareness around climate change by having markers of flood levels. We could look at ways that we try and connect up green areas of the city. And it's a really exciting opportunity. And the point of the strategy is not to dictate what we're doing now, but it's to set an envelope of which we can enable us to progress through coming up with what suits the city. So I'm going to switch topics a bit and start to talk about costing nuances. So this table shows a summary of present value costs of options for different standards of protections, i.e. different return periods for flood risk, but built in different and also built in different epochs. As the majority of the cost is due to construction of the foundations or very poor soil conditions, we're basically building in a riverbed. What we find is actually nominal changes in wall heights have a small impact on the whole life costs of the works, as you can see from the relatively small increase in capital costs due to the standard of protections or the epochs. What we also found was we tested the low public realm costs versus having quite high quality finishes and high public realm costs. And throughout the works, and this is along the whole length of it, if you were to sort of say, right, we're going to do high public realm works, it's an order of magnitude of 20 million, which sounds like a phenomenal amount. But when you consider the magnitude of what you're already investing, a little bit more gives you a much higher quality finish. We've also assessed 2 levels of different climate change allowances, which are based on the flood and coastal erosion risk management and the national planning policy framework. And the planning policy framework climate change protection requirements are more onerous, resulting in an increase in flood defence height. But that's what new developments need to build need to ensure their properties are safe to effectively. Well, not safe, the risk reduction is reduced to be pedantic. But in reality, there's no set defence level that we're instructed we have to build to. So the height that we set these to can be led by our local choices to help us as a city have a more value for money. So the Environment Agency grant and aid funding, which sets the budget that they will invest and support these flood defences, is based on a calculation based on the most cost-effective solution to the nation. And it's open to different phasing strategies for the management of climate change and local choice, and therefore it does allow Bristol to promote a strategy that serves its ambitions. So the planning policy states that new developments must be flood-free for a 1 in 200 annual chance tidal and 1 in 100 fluvial for a lifetime. And a commitment to a strategy that supports this requirement at a city level will enable future developments to be constructed much more easily. So therefore, for Bristol, the local choice option described will allow a planning policy compatible standard of protection at not a massive higher price, and therefore it's likely to help potential developers to invest. And it can be I would say the level of effort we've gone into understanding these nuances of height changes in the defences is not necessarily normal at the strategic case, but it's really helpful to make for Bristol and the public to understand what the effect of those choices are and what the benefits might be. So this slide, I just want to use it to summarise some of the key data we've got. So we're planning to construct defences in 2 phases in 2020 and 2060s. Well, we're anticipating that the phase 1 could be split into 2 build stages, and each build stage could have their own separate outline business case, detailed design and construction approach. And the local choice is a strategy that addresses the planning policy requirements, and it's one that we think is worth it. And in the table, you can see that the build 1, which concentrates on getting the gates installed at Entrance Lock and Neffham Lock and some of the early works around to make sure that there's no adverse effects, happens early on, but the grant and aid funding is very much reliant on the whole project being installed, including the phase 2 works. So our aim is to try and time and program the works in a way to ensure that there's no adverse impacts at any point, and to try and increase the opportunities for integration with strategic objectives. For example, maybe leaving the works down at the Eastern Corridor to the latter part of the programme to try and enable some of those developments and plans that might be being considered down there be incorporated into the defences. So on this slide, it's just a bit of a summary on the delivery costs and the approach. I feel like I've just missed 2 slides. Oh, sorry, I was just talking about it. My slides have mixed up. So on, I'll talk about this one. So that what I was just talking about there was the delivery costs and approaches. On the financial benefit side, I think this is really important. So the GIA funding model is very much based on a prescribed calculation, which is based on the amount of existing properties which are effectively affected by flooding. And the total benefits that we can demonstrate as a result of including the flood defences are £0.9 billion, which is a phenomenal amount of money. And from that, we get some grant and aid money. But the other aspect of the benefits is much bigger than that. It's benefits to the city of Bristol. And if you look here, that the growth enabled at the unlocked sites and how much benefit we might get from that, we're talking at least sort of £7 billion. And if you add up all of the benefits from all the different sort of citywide strategic benefits that we achieve, such as avoiding commercial property damage, job creation through construction, avoiding disruption to the tourism sector, it adds up to about £8 billion. And so that's a massive benefit to the city of Bristol that we need to realise. I'm going to jump this slide because I've already talked through it. So just to finish off, a little bit on the environmental assessment. We've already been speaking to relevant authorities and communities, and there is an internal steering group that has been supporting us. And so far, we've had a voluntary strategic environment assessment, a WFD assessment, an environmental impact assessment pre-scoping report. And that's really identified some key environmental issues, such as terrestrial ecology, estuarine ecology, landscaping, architecture and heritage, land quality and land use, traffic and transport. And we will really look to incorporate and take those environmental issues into account as we proceed with the project. So just to finish off with a few lessons learned. First of all, I've really enjoyed the collaborative effort between the EA, ARUP and BCC. We're all local people and our knowledge and experience of the area has really helped to bring to life both the problem and to develop a strategic way forward. But to summarise some key lessons learned from my perspective, one is that you need to prepare different levels of material to brief different people. We have some very highly technical people interested in the project, and then some people who come from areas where they're not technical. You need to prepare much simpler, clearer English and just keep it simple. And then I found that the EA prescriptive approach doesn't really tie up with the Bristol City Council approach, but trying to create the same amount of information and background and body of evidence, but enable both of those processes to go forward, is actually has to be planned in terms of your messaging. The third point is very much about understanding what you're trying to build where, because the nuances of the different areas, the past, the present, the future, all the way along the route of the flood defences need to be clearly articulated and understood. And in cities, I think where flood defences have to be incorporated, the benefits of unlocking those potential brownfield sites through flood defences can really significantly contribute to the strategic case. And then the last bit is, if you can try and incorporate flexibilities into your solution and into your approach to flood defence, that can really help the cities set visions and to enable them to work to integrate it with the city's policies. So I've come to the end of the talk. All I want to say is we really welcome your input to the strategy through feedback. This slide contains the relevant links to an online system where you can add comments. And thank you so much for listening. I'm going to hand back to the chair.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation, really, really interesting. So thank you, Matt, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Henrietta. We've got a few questions that have come in during the talk, and there's a few more coming in now. So perhaps what I'll start on the earlier questions and work through a few of these. So we've got two questions on the service water flooding aspect. Was that something that was incorporated? There's a question around properties at risk from service water flooding, whether that was incorporated in the modelling.
Yeah, I'll answer the surface water flooding question. So how many properties at risk from surface water flooding? Well, in our local flood risk management strategy, we've identified about 22,000 residential properties at risk of flooding across the entire Bristol city. I personally, and I think colleagues would agree, that that's probably a higher estimate, and that was work based on modelling undertaken back in 2009-2010. We recently updated our surface water model, and that kind of, although we haven't updated those figures in terms of reporting them through to Europe through the flood risk regulations and the preliminary flood risk assessments, early count that we did on the back of that was looking at more along sort of 3,000 to 5,000 properties, so a significant reduction, and that, like I say, again, is across the entire city. In terms of how many properties are at risk from surface water flooding in the area benefiting from the flood strategy, I couldn't answer that with an actual number, but the benefits that were calculated were capped by 25% to account for the potential for future surface water schemes going forward in the future. I think hopefully that answers that one. In terms of is there a risk that tidal defences will impound surface water or fluvial floodwaters behind them? I think Dan's done a great job in explaining how we've taken a holistic look at the tributaries coming into the River Avon and the impact that the proposals will have on those tribs, and how we've managed to come up with a scheme that doesn't have an adverse impact on those tributaries. Around surface water, I suppose you need to bear in mind that the River Avon corridor is an exceptionally urban area. There's no sort of surface water runoff, as I would describe it. It's all a positively drained urban environment. So obviously, lots of Wessex water out public sewer outfalls into the river, and of course, by incorporating these raised defences, there's the potential for elevated water levels, and that could limit the ability of the surface water network to discharge into the system. And we've got Wessex Water, our local sewerage provider, working with us as part of our stakeholder working group. So that's something that will need to be assessed as we move forward into the future. Hopefully that answers those two questions on surface water. Richard, where do you want to move on to next?
Okay, thank you, Matt. There's questions shooting in now. Let's try and see if there's any. There's a few around the uncertainty of the modelling. So we've got one from Claire Waller here. What do you think the main source of uncertainty is in your modelling, and how have you accounted for that in your optioneering and economics?
Dan, do you want to take that one?
So sources of uncertainty include parameters used in the model, as well as how high the tide would get, how much water is coming down the river system. So some work had been undertaken on the strategy to identify residual uncertainties and try to quantify how much kind of potential risk there is there in terms of defence levels. So that was applying the new Environment Agency residual uncertainty guidance shortly after it came out. And that identified preliminary amounts of freeboard to be included in the scheme design to account for those residual uncertainties. So that's been adopted within the scheme costs. But as the project will progress to more detailed stages, the intention is obviously to try and reduce those uncertainties through potentially more detailed analysis and things like that. Okay,
thank you, Dan. Thank you for that. Question from Thomas Green here, also on modelling. Just quickly, what model package was used for the modelling, and what climate change scenarios were used to derive the design water levels?
The model is a Flood Modeler Pro 2-flow model. It's a linked 1D, 2D model. In terms of the climate change scenarios, as Henrietta mentioned, we had to look at two different sets of guidance. So one of the first guidance was what was required for flood and coastal erosion risk management appraisal guidance, and the second climate change guidance was for MPPF flood risk assessment. So we were looking at both so that we could not only look to see what funding the scheme could attract, but also to look to see potentially how much higher would the defences need to be in order to support the regeneration, which will require slightly more onerous climate change allowances. We also used an even more precautionary allowance, I think, for assessing residual risk with the scheme in place. So we had some, doomsday scenarios to kind of understand, potentially what would the evacuation routes need to be.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we'll just work through a few of the rest of the questions. Does anyone, there's a question here about the potential impacts of the Severn barrage. Was that something that was considered, or was that sort of part separately into that scheme? May or may not progress.
Do you want me to take that one? Yeah, so the Severn barrage is not something that's definitely going ahead. So it's not something that impacts the city of Bristol as it stands at the moment. We have to develop a solution that will work in the timescales that we anticipate. The risk is increasing and increasing. So it is unfortunate in terms of the chicken and egg approach of, for example, if a Severn barrage was to go in, depending on where it would get located, there would be some flood defence benefits, but the way the current government looks at barrages and lagoons doesn't really take that into account or enable that to be considered at the moment.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got a question from King Longman here. What engagement has been done to obtain funding other than FDGIA? If the benefits are related to flooding, why should flood money pay for these benefits?
Sorry, Richard, I can't quite hear you.
It was the question about funding, Hen, so I'll take that one. Lots of questions coming in around funding. People have rightly identified that we're going to need to collate a huge cocktail of funding or investment to actually deliver this scheme. So this is a really hot topic at the moment. Right at the top of the council, our senior leadership team, including the mayor and his cabinet, are working on this as we speak. So not my place really to talk about what lobbying has been done and what conversations are being had at that level, but certainly there's an awful lot of work ongoing to develop this funding strategy. And like I say, it'll be a cocktail of funding opportunities. So just to highlight a few, SIL, if it remains a thing, is £3.5 million per year in Bristol. That gives us potentially up to £35 million over the course of the decade where we want to deliver phase one. The devolution deal from the West of England Combined Authority offers the region £1 billion worth of investment for infrastructure projects that enable growth in the region. So if our project doesn't do that, I don't know what does. And then the list goes on. We've got economic development funds, we've got prudential borrowing from the City Council. We're already investing about £10 million in terms of cost avoided on the works that we're doing along Cumberland Road to make sure that those foundations are put in place. So quite quickly, actually, when you think about the funding gap that we're faced with and all the opportunities to fill it, it doesn't seem quite as daunting as it certainly did to me when I first heard the number.
Thank you, Matt. There's quite a few questions here. We've got quite a few around the development that's currently planned around St Philip's Marsh. So there's lots of development applications in around the feeder canal and what was Arena Island for the university. So there's various ones to do with what is required of that development. How does that link in with the strategy?
Yeah, that's probably one for me again. So again, huge topic of debate at the moment within the council and with our colleagues at the Environment Agency and with the developer community. I was holding a session just like this last week with the development community that have interest in and around the River Avon, particularly around St Philip's Marsh and the feeder canal. And clearly, you know, one of the driving objectives behind this strategy is to do it in such a way that enables sustainable development. I'm not sure if we touched on it in our presentation, but in terms of flood coastal erosion risk management guidance, the preferred standard of protection on economic grounds is actually the 1 in 75-year standard. But we're promoting as a local choice for Bristol to promote the 1 in 200-year standard of protection, including an allowance for climate change, to enable that development to come forward. Of course, they'll still need to manage residual risk and put in place evacuation procedures and that type of thing. But the point is we're doing this very much in a way that it aims to unlock those areas, particularly around St Philip's Marsh, to come forward. I'll just highlight the fact that in our kind of local plan review, where we identified St Philip's Marsh as potentially an area that would come forward as new mixed-use development, as an area of growth and regeneration in the updated local plan, we did make very clear at that time that we would expect flood risk to be addressed on a strategic basis. So we're not supportive of sites that are coming forward to try and, you know, wash their own face, so to speak, and kind of put in place their own mitigation measures. We are, you know, we want to do this in a holistic way and make sure that we've got the strategic infrastructure in place, or at least we have the certainty of delivery that it's going to be delivered before we kind of can support new mixed use developments in those areas. Hopefully that goes some way to answering that one.
That's great, thank you for that. A question here from Trevor O'Dowd about how the consultation process has been working out in the face of COVID-19. Has that been a problem so far with the online approach?
So in some ways it's been better. In other ways it's been rubbish, but in some ways it's been better because we've definitely been able to reach more people and organisations and groups and individuals than we would have been able to do so in a face-to-face kind of environment. But on the flip side, obviously, you know, that's not how a lot of people want to operate, and we have at least been able to go and talk to people and businesses, in particular around St Philip's Marsh, in a face-to-face way, because those businesses have kind of COVID procedures set up, and we can just, you know, go outside and talk about things on site, so, as it were. But yeah, it has been challenging, but like I say, it's also presented opportunities to make sure that we do things, you know, we speak to as many people as we can. And Councillor Beach, our cabinet member for spatial planning, and I have been doing lots of these sorts of sessions with various groups, like I mentioned, the developer community, but also you know, Bristol Civic Society. We've got an event coming up with the Architecture Centre. We've got people with physical and mental disabilities that we've been talking to. We've you know, huge numbers of groups that we've been able to reach through this kind of online platform, that we wouldn't probably have been able to do so in a face-to-face environment. So I think it's something to bear in mind for if we ever get back to any kind of normality. You know, future in consultations very well may make more use of this type of technology.
Thank you, Matt. Interesting time. It was good to see how that's all working out. We've got another question here from Billy Mines about cross-country learning. Just wonder if Bristol City Council has benefited from any lessons learned on previous flood schemes, and as Sean had a tidal walls in West Sussex as an example here.
Yeah, I mean, Hen's got first-hand experience of this, but I've been talking to, locally, I've been speaking to people in Bridgewater who are promoting a tidal barrier. We've been speaking to Weymouth, who've had very, very similar issues to us in Bristol around, is it a barrier, is it walls, is it both, and that kind of stuff. Derby's been a really interesting example where that interface with the development community has been integral to how they've developed their approach. Hen, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, so I'll just add in, Cork's quite an interesting case study. So they went for a high wall solution, but they had significant pushback to consider a barrage. So they had to do a lot of work and looking at the barrage. But what was interesting about there was their approach to consultation and taking people along on the street. Leeds is really interesting as well, because they're all about incorporating defences within developments and existing and new and proposed properties, and they've done that really successfully. So that's an interesting case study as well.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of questions around some of the costings and benefits calculated here. There's one about tourism, about how basically how sort of the benefits of tourism were calculated, given that it's a relatively intangible potential benefit. Could we hear a bit more about how it was estimated?
I'll come in a little bit, but I'm not going to give a great answer because our economist is not here who did all the calculations. But we basically look at if there's a flood event, how long does it take to clear up and get back to normal, and then what is the effect of that on tourism. And we also looked at what's the potential in terms of looking forward for tourism as a result. It's quite interesting how the CA and government view tourism, because they have this sort of interesting approach where they say if tourism disappears from one city, it's going to go to another city. So it doesn't actually affect the overall economy in the UK. And that's quite interesting. I find that quite strange because it can significantly affect a city in an approach, but that's their thinking on it.
Okay, interesting. Can you take a question about the 7 billion for? There's a question here. We have about 7 billion of benefits from growth at the unlocked sites.
Yes, so I can answer that briefly, Matt. Feel free to jump in if you want to add in. So basically, taking the areas of land that become unlocked as a result and giving it a land value effectively, that's how you calculate it. Does that answer that quite precisely? Matt, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I suppose the reason why the value is so high, I guess, is because the area that at most significant risk of flooding is in an area called St Philip's Marsh, clues in the name, but that is a principal industrial and warehousing area. So the land values there with that existing planning allocation are relatively low in comparison to other areas of the city. Now, by introducing flood defences that enable those developments to come forward without the need for, hugely costly on-site mitigation, which we don't even think is possible anyway, the land value uplift associated with that brings huge benefit to the economy, not least in the jobs it's created, the new homes, the construction associated with all of that, and the list goes on. So I'm no economist, but one of our national experts in the field, Luke Ballantyne, certainly is, and he did a lot of work in estimating those benefits.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll just take a couple more questions. We're drawing towards the close. Got one here about whether natural softer approaches to the channel and flood defences in the eastern corridor were considered.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is one area where we potentially do have some more space made available to us. So that again is the St Philip's Marsh area, which is identified for huge areas of growth and regeneration. So although the existing footprint that we have to work with at the moment is quite constrained, albeit there is a hard engineering solution that we could deliver, and that's actually the one that's been costed for the purposes of demonstrating feasibility. Much more aspirational kind of vision for that area is for sites to gift or work with us to incorporate these kind of much softer, wider corridor measures to kind of give us these additional benefits that I was talking about in my presentation around improved biodiversity, green spaces, better walking and cycling links, and just a nicer environment to be down at the river compared to what it currently is. And I spotted another question around whether those kind of more softer green approaches might introduce the potential for erosion to the banks. And obviously no design has been done to date, but that will very much need to be considered as outline designs have progressed, in the same way that deposition will need to be considered, because we have the tide coming up and down through there 2 times a day, a lot of silt and all the rest of it. So that would need to be considered in terms of how it interacts with a usable environment.
Thank you. There's a few questions here around the theme of how we sort of transition from what's currently prospective developers submitting flood risk assessments for new planning applications with sort of current level of flood risk without defences, to when the strategy starts being constructed. And one's around the general timeframe going forward from here to action, and another one's about will there be changes to what's expected of developers when just unlocked land benefits from the flood defences.
Okay, yeah, lots of things all wrapped up in various questions around development and things like that here. So the strategic outline case has a chapter on development interface and what it means for development going forward. And the key phrase here that we talk about a lot with our colleagues at the Environment Agency and ourselves with our planning authority colleagues is around reasonable certainty of delivery. Once we've got the reasonable certainty of delivery that these defences are going to be forthcoming, that means having a reasonable funding strategy in place and phasing plan and planning instruments to talk about how the interface with developers will continue. Once we've got to that point in time, that's when more flexibility will be allowed, and we'll get to a point in time where development will be able to come forward in such a way that it may be assumed that defences are constructed. So what that means in practice at the moment, when development is coming forward, they not only need to raise their floor levels by, in some cases approaching 2 meters, they also need to take account of the impacts of compensatory flood storage. So by raising ground within the floodplain, obviously we lose some of our floodplain and we need to compensate for that within the site, which is very, very difficult on a constrained site in itself. So by having these defences with a reasonable prospect of delivery forthcoming, then development would only need to deal with the residual risk. So in terms of the design flood, that is the 1 in 200 year tidal flood or 1 in 100 year fluvial flood, the development would no longer need to worry about that. They can just build out their development at existing ground floor uses, having a much better interface with the existing ground level active frontages and all that type of stuff. And with the development that would then only be expected to deal with the consideration to overtopping, residual risk, localized breaches, that type of thing. And we anticipate that at least in the interim, those types of issues could be managed through evacuation plans, flood warning procedures and things like that. So hopefully that answers most of it. I noticed there's a question from Clive Onions mentioned about how flood compensation will be addressed and why is it not a problem for this strategy? Well, it very much has been. A lot of the work that ARUP have been doing over the past year or more now is about making sure we don't have any adverse impacts, and Dan touched on it in his presentation. It's been evident that by elevating water levels, by incorporating raised defences within central Bristol, water levels are impacted as far upstream as Keynsham. So it very much has been an issue for us, and it's been a lot of the work that ARUP have been doing around developing a scheme that doesn't adversely impact upon third parties to come up with a holistic overall strategic approach that is ultimately consensible, because it doesn't increase flood risk to third parties.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've hit 7:30, so I think we'll call those time and questions now. We'll have a look at sending out these questions and maybe get some more responses out in the follow-up. But everyone do remember there is the Bristol City Flood Strategy consultation open now. It'd be great to get some involvement in that consultation on the back of this presentation. I'd like to say thank you very much to Matt, Dan and Henrietta for taking time in the evening to provide this presentation. It's been really, really interesting. And wish you all a good evening. Thank you very much for your time.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.